So we've received so much fantastic feedback on our top 10 Hollywood heroes that we're doing an addendum video because of the great suggestions from all of you, so thank you. If you haven't watched the original, link in the description box. Let's consider the heroes we're about to discuss part of our extended honorable mentions, okay? As one comment reminded us, they're all heroes, and that's true. This is subjective. It's not really about the ranking per se, but rather simply acknowledging how these men and women serve their country so faithfully. So let's go. So let's start with Clark Gable. Now, there wasn't really an oversight on my part. We actually did a short video on him and the tragic death of his wife, Carol Lombard, who was on her way back from a war bond tour when her plane crashed. Clark was so devastated and really disconsolate that upon joining the Army Air Force, he insisted on going overseas, and then he insisted on seeing actual combat. Many have suggested that he may have had some type of death wish. Now, what's amazing about Clark is that he was 40 years old, well past the draft age, and yet he still enlisted as a private, mind you, and then went to officer candidate and aerial gunnery school. He was assigned to the 351st Bomb Group, and though neither ordered nor expected to do so, Clark Gable flew operational missions over Europe in a B-17 to get combat footage for the movie Combat America, this sort of propaganda film that he was working on. Now, depending on what you believe, those 5 missions he flew were either milk runs, which was another way of saying they weren't really that dangerous, or they were legit combat. There are varying accounts on how dangerous these flights were, and some have said that he even had a close encounter with anti-aircraft fire. Now, I'm not going to delve into all that. You can Google it and learn more. But suffice to say, the guy was a legit badass. He didn't have to enlist. He was well over the age. He didn't have to go to officer and gunnery school. He didn't have to insist on going to Europe. He could have easily milked some lame desk job in the US like so many others did. And he didn't have to insist on combat missions, whether they were dangerous or not. But he did, and that's pretty cool in my book. Look, I'm not saying he was Jimmy Stewart, but Clark Gable stepped up big time when others didn't, and he should have been in the original video, and that's a miss on my part. That's on me. So Julia Child. Okay, you may be surprised to see her on this list, or not if you watched one of our video shorts on her, but yes, that Julia Child. We all know her as one of the great culinary icons of the 20th century, but before she began cooking up delicious French cuisine, she actually worked for the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, and by some accounts, worked for legendary OSS leader Wild Bill Donovan himself. Now, if that's true, that's pretty cool stuff. Now, believe it or not, one of her first assignments was to develop shark repellent of all things. Yes, you heard me right, shark repellent. Not only were sharks a menace to downed airmen and seamen, but they also had this habit of investigating mines meant for German U-boats and Japanese vessels and exploding them, which had to be really, really gruesome. Julia actually concocted a rudimentary shark repellent that by the government's own estimate was 60% effective. Now, I'm not sure how you measure 60% effective. I don't even know what that means, but it is pretty cool. Julia would often joke that the shark repellent was her first culinary contribution to the world. And by the way, her OSS service didn't end there. She was stationed at multiple places throughout Southeast Asia during the war and handled a lot of classified information. And it was during the war when she met her husband, Paul, who also worked for the OSS. And it was actually Paul who encouraged her to attend cooking school when they lived in Paris. And the rest, as they say, is history. So Donald Pleasance. Again, I didn't forget him. We've done 2 short videos on Donald, and he starred in my all-time favorite movie, The Great Escape, as well as my favorite episode of Columbo. So I'm very familiar with Donald Pleasance. But for some reason, I simply brain cramped on him. I think I briefly mentioned him in the original video as it related to a story about the Great Escape director, John Sturges, but he deserved way more airtime in that video. Now, what's remarkable about Donald Pleasance is that he was already a pretty successful stage actor and was initially opposed to the draft and the war. Essentially, he was a conscientious objector, but he changed his tune during the Battle of Britain, at which point he enlisted the RAF and became a gunner and a radio operator. The guy flew 60 combat missions, you heard me, 60, over Europe before being shot down, where he would spend 9 months as a POW at Stalag Luft 1. Ironic, given that he played a downed RAF photographer in The Great Escape. And here's a little footnote. Donald Pleasance was so malnourished and so gaunt from being a POW that he spent 6 months in a hospital following the war just to get properly nourished and put on some weight. Unbelievable. Donald Pleasance was a true and total badass. Now let's talk about the brothers Arness. You know them as James Arness and Peter Graves, both changed their name. Again, we've done multiple shorts on both of them, but they should have been on the original list in the video, or at least honorable mention. Certainly James. Before James Arness was Marshal Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke, he was a legit World War II hero. At age 21, he was one of the first men to hit the beaches of Anzio with the Third Army. In fact, because he was so tall, he stood 6'7", he was ordered first into the water to test the depth. Can you imagine that? The guy was essentially a guinea pig for one of the deadliest battles of World War II. He was also seriously wounded in the leg from machine gun fire and would walk with a limp the rest of his life, which is pretty noticeable in Gunsmoke, by the way. In fact, Gunsmoke ran 20 years, one of the longest series ever, and through the years, his limp gets noticeably worse. His brother Peter Graves said that Jim was in tremendous pain all the time and never once complained, and he never whined about it. It took the guy 18 months of rehab following the war just to learn how to walk again. They just don't make guys like James Arness anymore. As for kid brother Peter Graves, he idolized his big brother and followed him off to war, joining the Army Air Force when he turned 18. Not much is known about his service, other than he achieved the rank of corporal and flew combat missions in the Pacific. Interesting footnote, Peter was the one who encouraged James to go to Hollywood, and ironically enough, Peter followed James and scored his first big breakthrough role with Stalag 17 a few years before James Arness scored his breakthrough role on Gunsmoke. And yes, I know James Arness played The Thing before that, but his big breakthrough came as Matt Dillon on Gunsmoke. Tyrone Power. Now this was a big miss on my part. In fact, we haven't done a short on him, and I'm not sure why. He just hasn't been top of mind, but he should have been. Now Power, like Jimmy Stewart, was already a big star by the time the war began. He hadn't won an Oscar like Jimmy, and he wasn't quite that level, but with The Mark of Zorro in 1940, he was a rising star and box office gold, no doubt about it. He joined the Marines in 1942 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Like Jimmy Stewart, Tyrone Power was an aviator before joining the Marines, so after a short stint in flight training programs, he earned his wings and was promoted to first lieutenant. The Marines considered him too old for active combat flying, so he volunteered to pilot cargo planes so that he could be in an active combat zone. Now that's badass stuff. He sent to the Pacific, where he flew missions carrying cargo in and wounded Marines out during Iwo Jima and Okinawa, two of the bloodiest battles in Marine history. And by the way, he stays in the Marine Corps Reserves for the rest of his life and reaches the rank of major before dying unexpectedly and tragically at the age of 44. Sad ending to an amazing life. Tyrone Power, God bless him. So Fred Gwynne, another huge miss on my part. And we did do a short on him, one of my favorites actually. And again, just a whiff on my part, I don't know why. You know, Fred's one of those guys, he's fascinating. He sort of reminds me of Sorrel book, Boss Hogg. He went to an elite private school, he graduated from Harvard, and throughout his life, he was a really accomplished artist in addition to being a great actor. He's another guy who either lied about his age or forged his signature to get into the war underage. It seems like there were so many of those guys. Fred served as a radio man aboard the USS Manville, which was a submarine chaser. Now in our short video, I mentioned that, and it received 1 million comments of how could a guy who stood 6'6" be on a submarine? Well, the answer was the Manville wasn't a submarine, it was a sub-chaser, that's how. The Manville saw action all over the Pacific, including supporting the amphibious assaults at Tinian and Saipan, among other places. And following the war, he parlayed his height, that really deep voice of his, that unique look, into a pretty prolific Hollywood career, including one of the most iconic characters in TV history, Herman Munster. And his very last role was also one of his best, as the judge in My Cousin Vinny. He would die from pancreatic cancer shortly after filming it. Fred Gwynne, a true legend. Now, I mentioned Sorrel book, Boss Hogg. He did make our previous video, and for good reason. The man spoke 12 languages and fought in the Korean War. But did you know that his partner in crime in Hazard County, Roscoe Coltraine, was also a World War II hero? James Best joined the Army Air Force in 1944 and trained as an aerial gunner on a B-17. But the war was nearly over in Europe, and so they transferred him to military police. Go figure, both Boss Hogg and Roscoe Coltraine were genuine war heroes, and yet they still couldn't catch those rascally Duke boys. And finally, there's the heartbreaking case of Veronica Lake, who for a brief while in the early 1940s was one of the great femme fatales of Hollywood. Today, she's mostly remembered, if remembered at all, for her famous Peekaboo hairstyle, which was all the rage in the 1940s. In fact, it was the Rachel long before there was a Rachel from Friends. It was her trademark look, and soon housewives across the country were trying to copy her with the long flowing locks. When the war broke out and women started going into the factory jobs, there was a wave of gruesome industrial accidents from all the long hair next to the machinery. So much so that the Army actually reached out to Veronica and asked her to cut her hair, which she did, so as to change the national style. Her new look was dubbed the V for Victory bun. Now, I know you're going to ask, why didn't she just put her hair in a ponytail or wear a hairnet or do something else? I don't know, I wasn't there. But the fact is, she cut her hair and industrial accidents immediately plummeted. But sadly, so did her career. Evidently, Hollywood and moviegoers weren't buying her femme fatale persona in short hair. And even while her movie career was stalled, she continued to crisscross the country and raise money for the war effort. Now, that is very cool and very badass. We've done several short videos of Veronica, and it's really a sad rest of the story. For lots of reasons, she became a heavy drinker, and she essentially drank herself to death before turning 50. Today, she's mostly forgotten, unless you watch a lot of Turner Classic Movies, but we really should remember her for the patriot that she was, and for a brief while, being one of the great femme fatales of Hollywood. Okay, I'm gonna cut it off here, but I'm sure there'll be a part 3 because there's probably others that I'm leaving off the list. So leave your suggestions in the comments. Till next time, I'm Nick Ragone.